Welcome to Military Analytics. The war in Eastern Europe is causing alarms in the Scandinavian countries. Recently, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Poland expelled many Russian diplomats on suspicion of espionage. In addition, Poland had arrested a total of 12 Russian spies, 3 of which were last month. While these events escalated diplomatic tensions, the Kremlin retaliated similarly. However, an event occurred that the Kremlin did not anticipate. A Russian commander had crossed the border and surrendered to Norway. The commander of the Russian army had made big confessions by fleeing to Norway in the past months. The Russian commander, who was captured by Norway, gave key information about the plans and tactics of the Russian army. In mid-January, the alarm sounded at a military border guard base in northern Norway. Someone had crossed the Russian border illegally, and Norwegian soldiers were tasked with finding this person. It turned out that the intruder was a former commander of the Wagner Group who managed to enter Norway by crossing a river while wearing white camouflage. Wagner's former commander had crossed borders to seek asylum in Norway. This story, which started 3 months ago with a demand for escape and asylum, takes on a completely different dimension in May. Andrei Medvedev, 26, was involved in some crimes in Norway. Wagner faced his former commander's prison sentence. Let's take a closer look at the situation in which Medvedev was involved in Norway. Medvedev got into a fight outside the Oslo bar on February 22nd. The former commander prevented a police officer from fulfilling his duty in this fight. The crimes that Medvedev was involved in were not limited to this much. He added a new one to his crimes by carrying an air pistol in public on March 14th. His lawyer, Brynjulf Risnes, told reporters that the suspect pleaded guilty only to the shooting incident. But the former commander denies that he abused a police officer. Medvedev expressed that he was very ashamed of what had happened. He explained his actions with an instinctive body reaction to the pain he felt when he was pulled out of a police van. The former Russian commander stated in court that he had no intention of harming the police officers. He also stated that he bought the air pistol in self-defense from a shop in Oslo because he was afraid someone would attack him. He claimed that he was verbally abused in public. Prosecutor Vegard Jensen sought 18 days for Medvedev, including 5 days he was detained for inflicting violence on the police, and a suspended sentence for other crimes he pleaded guilty to. The court was expected to announce its decision and sentence by the second week of May. If the former commander of Wagner PMC is convicted, he cannot be sent outside of Norway. Norwegian authorities told reporters that persons convicted of violent crimes could be granted residence permits. However, the authorities stated that this permit is not permanent, but temporary. A spokesperson for the Department of Immigration declined to comment privately on Medvedev's case. Separately, Medvedev went on to speak with Kripos, Norway's criminal police agency tasked with investigating war crimes, about his time spent in Ukraine with the Wagner militia. Now let's go back to January and refresh our memories. The border, which is about 200 kilometers long, is in an uninhabited area. There is no fence at the border, but sources within the Norwegian army told the media that it was almost impossible to cross undetected by the Russian border guards. When Andrei Medvedev arrived in Norway, he knocked on the door of a civilian house to ask for help. The soldiers detained him 3 kilometers from the border and then immediately handed him over to the police. Medvedev later sought asylum. He stated that he was willing to testify against Yevgeny Prigozhin, nicknamed Putin's chief, the founder of the Wagner Group. The story reads like the beginning of a James Bond movie, but how it will unfold is unclear. Currently, Medvedev has witness status, but that may change as the investigation evolves. After a brief detention at an immigration center, Norway released him on January 25th. Legal discourse has focused on how the international community can hold Russia and its leaders accountable for their actions under state responsibility or international criminal law. However, this present case raises new and different questions. Was Medvedev a warrior with a warrior privilege or a criminal without the right to use force? Before addressing specific international law issues, it is worth noting that although Norway criminalizes membership of terrorist groups, it is based on NDU lists that do not include the Wagner Group among these groups. Therefore, simply being a member of the group is not a crime under Norwegian law. Medvedev can only be prosecuted if his involvement in criminal activities is proven. How should Norway deal with Medvedev? Warrior status with all the privileges it entails is central to the question of how to deal with Medvedev and the other Wagner members. Russia has previously been very clear that the Wagner Group is not acting on behalf of Russia and that Russia is not responsible for the group's actions, despite information on Wagner forces' activities in Ukraine. The Russian leadership does not appear to approve of their behavior or increase their control over them. In fact, Wagner's position appears to be based on a personal bond between Prigozhin and Putin. According to reports, despite the fact that the Wagner Group openly uses Russian military equipment and training facilities and operates alongside Russia's regular armed forces in Ukraine, there is not enough information at this point to draw any conclusions about the group's status. The difficulty is that we will never know the exact nature of the links between the Wagner Group and the Russian authorities. Meanwhile, similar cases in Norway will continue. Given that part of the Wagner Group's aim was to offer Russia a reasonable denial of its actions, it is unlikely that Moscow will accept responsibility for their behavior. It is also unlikely that Russia will demand the treatment of Medvedev as a combatant with combat immunity. This will require the Russian government to accept command responsibility for the Wagner Group's actions or failures to prevent violations they have committed. Therefore, the most effective way to hold someone accountable for the actions of Wagner members is to accept the Russians' narrative of individual responsibility and that the Wagner Group is not their responsibility. The status of the Wagner Group will affect the investigation of what crimes may have been committed. The LAC is strict on the requirement to support the principles of discrimination and proportionality and rules prohibiting indiscriminate attacks. The question of war crimes is not only relevant to a potential prosecution. Medvedev applied for asylum. Norway does not normally grant asylum if the applicant has committed war crimes. Medvedev claimed that he witnessed the atrocities but did not carry them out. The Norwegian court acquitted Medvedev of espionage, etc., and will sentence him to 2 weeks in prison. The confessions of former Russian commanders about the Russian army and the Wagner Group undoubtedly contain important information for both Norway and the alliance. The Norwegian court ruled that the Russian commander was not a spy, but the Russian commander was sentenced to prison for disrupting public order. One of the questions raised in the Norwegian media is whether Medvedev will be deported to Ukraine or Russia. Regarding Russia, Medvedev claimed that there was real risk to his life if extradited. In the case of Ukraine, it is questionable whether Norway could hand over a member of the opposition armed forces to be a prisoner of war. To this end, Medvedev's status under the law may relate to the application of the neutrality law. What will happen next? As stated at the beginning, it is unclear how this story will end. With this knowledge and his willingness to speak, Medvedev will above all be a valuable resource for the Norwegian authorities. Whether Norway should at some stage determine the legal effect of his membership in the Wagner Group, and therefore his status under international law, will depend on what the investigation reveals. Whatever the outcome, the case reminds us of the complexities involved in holding individuals responsible for crimes committed during the armed conflict. Medvedev's asylum in Norway increased the tension between Russia and Norway. The ropes between the two countries are coming to the breaking point with each passing day. In the past weeks, Norway has declared persona non grata 15 people working at the Russian embassy in Oslo. Russian diplomats were defined as members of intelligence services engaged in activities incompatible with their diplomatic status. These diplomats are required to leave the country. The Norwegian government website reports Norway aims to protect its national interests by deporting 15 Russian diplomats it accuses of espionage. In summary, tensions between Russia and Norway are escalating. Norway's expulsion of Russian diplomats and its embracing of the former commander creates a cold shower effect on Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian soldiers made statements to the press and shared very special information about the operations. We bring you the latest information from the battlefield and the statements of the Ukrainian soldiers. Before the war between Russia and Ukraine started, interesting predictions about war strategies were being shared all over the world. For example, many experts agreed with the claim that the era of the tanks was over. But this war has revealed that the reality is different. The ground army and tank forces fighting on the front line are crucial to winning the war. It is believed that the course of the war will change completely after Western countries send tanks to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is planning to organize many counter-operations using Leopard 2 tanks. The Kremlin is very worried about this. Russia is making very interesting plans against the Ukrainian army's tanks. The news in the Russian press today was quite surprising. According to this news, Russian soldiers who succeed in destroying the Leopard 2 tank will be rewarded with $72,000. Russia is so afraid of Leopard 2 tanks that had to take such a measure. However, Russian commanders know very well that this tactic alone will not work. That's why different plans are being implemented. Russian soldiers are constantly digging very deep trenches in the areas they occupy. These trenches are dug so big that the tank cannot pass over them. In this way, Russian commanders aim to stop the advance of Leopard 2 tanks. But the Ukrainian army manages to foil this plan. The drones used by the Ukrainian army immediately detect Russian soldiers digging trenches. These areas are hit by drones. Russian soldiers cannot dig trenches to avoid being targeted by drones. The drones of the Ukrainian army continue to check every moment. It is known that many Russian soldiers died in these operations while digging trenches. According to the data released by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, 920 Russian soldiers had been killed within the last 24 hours. Nearly 1,000 soldiers die in the Russian army every day. This makes the Russian army very unsuccessful in the war. Ukrainian soldiers are getting a huge advantage over the Russian army. There are many soldiers in the Russian army, but the Ukrainian army continues to fight this war successfully, resisting the Russian soldiers. Today, a Ukrainian soldier described what he experienced in the conflict. A Ukrainian soldier named Ari put up a great fight against the soldiers of the Wagner Group, Russia's mercenary company. Andriy described the Wagner fighters came towards them like a flood. The fighting continued for 10 hours without interruption. Andriy described dozens of rounds being exchanged from machine guns. He also said that because of the prolonged firing, the AK-47 rifles got so hot that they had to keep changing them. This conflict was really like something out of a war movie. According to Andriy, there were only 20 soldiers left in this Ukrainian army unit in the Russian army. 200 soldiers launched an attack. The Wagner Group releases notorious criminals from Russian prisons and sends them to the battlefield. These soldiers are not given adequate training. Wagner's leaders are literally sending these soldiers to their deaths. Russian soldiers who do not even know how to hold a gun started running and shooting towards the Ukrainian army. The brave soldiers of the Ukrainian army never ran away. The Ukrainian soldiers immediately took up their machine guns and started firing at the Wagner soldiers running towards them. Even when these soldiers were shot in the arms, they continued to run forward until the last 10. They mercilessly stepped on the falling and dying soldiers. According to Andriy, these moments were like a zombie movie. The Ukrainian soldiers fired several times at the Russian soldiers running towards them. When these soldiers died, the Russian soldiers launched an attack from 2 separate fronts on the flanks. The Ukrainian soldiers who ran out of bullets while fighting the first soldiers sent in had to act very quickly and bravely to repel this new attack. Within seconds, the soldiers switched bullets and continued fighting. The new attack of the Russian soldiers was stopped once again. Just when the Ukrainian soldiers breathed a sigh of relief and thought that they had managed to repel this attack, something interesting happened. 30 more soldiers of the Wagner Group started running and shooting. The Ukrainian army killed these soldiers, too, and managed to repel the attack. These clashes lasted for hours. Ukrainian soldiers breathed a sigh of relief after this extraordinary struggle. Later examination began on the bodies of the Russian soldiers. Wagner soldiers were found to have bruises on their arms and under their eyes. It is speculated that Wagner's managers drugged these soldiers and sent them to the conflict zone because the Russian soldiers were trying to fight like madmen and running towards the bullets. There is a high probability that the Russian soldiers were tricked with drugs. Ukrainian soldier Andriy said that the Russian soldiers were running towards them in a very strange way. Andriy said that he felt like he was watching a zombie movie. It soon became clear why the Russian soldiers who were running over the dead and continuing to advance despite being wounded were behaving in such a way. Wagner's managers had made important promises to these soldiers. They thought that after only 6 months on the battlefield, they would be free. They had decided to take part in this war to avoid spending the rest of their lives in prison. But these prisoners did not know that they were being sent to die. The Wagner Group deceived the prisoners with whom they have signed a 6-month contract. They are told that if they fight for 6 months, they will be sent back to Russia and set free. The prisoners agreed and fought for 5 months. But when the last month comes, all these soldiers are used as human shields in deadly operations. Wagner's leaders plan war by sending these soldiers to their deaths. In order for the soldiers to accept this, they are constantly drugged. Russian authorities are trying to mislead prisoners, soldiers, and citizens to win this war. But despite all these methods, Russia cannot win the war. The Ukrainian army continues to carry out extensive operations to liberate Russian-occupied territories. According to experts, these operations will increase after the delivery of Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army will continue its counterattacks until it liberates all occupied cities. Ukrainian President Zelensky says in all of his speeches that they will definitely win this war. What do you think about the historic resistance of the Ukrainian army? What do you think about the Wagner Group's use of Russian prisoners? How do you think the Leopard 2 tanks will affect the course of this war? Do you think the Ukrainian army can win this war? The war in Ukraine has now literally turned into a battle of tanks and trenches. It was the first time that the front lines hosted such tension and violence because both sides of the war took action to show all their skills. In Bakhmut, which nowadays serves as a strategic bridge between Donetsk and Luhansk, Ukraine's tank battalions began to appear in the harsh steppes, similar to the attack sequences in World War II. The resulting scene showed us the real face of the war. The last time we saw such a large tank battalion at the Kremenna front line in the Luhansk region. But right now, the Ukrainian armed forces are advancing with their massive tank battalion towards the Russian and Wagner troops to get what they want from Bakhmut. Moving from the northern line of the city, mechanized and armored forces of the Ukrainian army are driving their main battle tanks deep into the Russian positions and fortifications in Bakhmut. Let's dive now into the front line where the Ukrainian tanks broke through the Russian lines in Bakhmut and repulsed the Russian attacks. The start of clashes in this critical area was something that both sides expected. Tank units of the Ukrainian army began to disperse the Russian defense in Bakhmut with the heavy artillery fire they launched. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces in Shasarvar also provided serious support to this hot clashes in Bakhmut. It was also seen that the Ukrainians were advancing towards the city of Bakhmut at the front line in Stepov and Ivanivka. In short, Bakhmut, which was described as the stronghold of the war, was besieged by the Ukrainian forces from both the east and the west. At the same time, the Ukrainian tanks continued to advance in Bakhmut by performing a shooting mission. In addition, the reconnaissance and HIMARS units of the Ukrainian forces were also providing fire support to the Ukrainian tank brigades from the forest areas in Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces managed to destroy about 3 Russian assault units per day in this critical city without launching mountain attacks. For this reason, the Russians have not been able to actively carry out offensive actions on the front lines in Bakhmut in recent days. In this regard, Ukrainian tank brigades, HIMARS artillery units, and reconnaissance operation teams do not give the Russians a breather. Using fresh Western-trained troops and modern equipment supplied by the US and its allies, Bakhmut has become a key element in efforts to weaken the Russian military ahead of a critical Ukrainian offensive. Waves of Russian soldiers are thrown into the chaos of war in Bakhmut with no synchronized coordination or direction. Therefore, Ukrainian tanks can easily target and destroy Russian resources in the city right now. In addition, the Bakhmutka River, which bisects the city, is now the line between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. Russian troops managed to cross the river south this week, threatening Ukraine's dominance of the city center. The Ukrainians formed an offensive ramp next to residential blocks damaged by weeks of shelling. Working hard day and night with our expert staff, we strive to deliver warm information and special analysis from the front to you as quickly as possible. You can support us with the Super Thanks button below. The Russians are trying to detonate these positions created by the Ukrainians with mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. But as we mentioned, the Ukrainian tank brigades advancing from the northern line of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian Special Operations Forces offensive and reconnaissance units from Shasarvar, Ivanovsky, and Stepover completely succeed in thwarting these aims of the Russians. Both sides suffer heavy losses, but Ukraine sets the odds are largely in their favor. Soldiers fighting in Bakhmut this week have described brutal urban clashes as Russia's turn of attrition against troops from the Wagner paramilitary group spearheading their offensive with units mostly made up of conscripted men from Russian prisons. In this regard, The commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Valery Zaluzhny, this week described the defense of Bakhmut as the key to the stability of the defense of the entire front. Also, Zaluzhny underlined that his troops and Ukrainian tank brigades will continue to break through the Russian defense in Bakhmut against artillery bombardments of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Kremlin throws infantry brigades and Wagner Group mercenaries into battle to try to encircle Bakhmut and cut off its defenders. Some Ukrainian brigades retreated and continued to defend from a new line several kilometers from the besieged city from which artillery fire can be heard. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense explained why part of the retreating Ukrainian tank troops maneuvered. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reported that the maintenance of the supply lines is becoming increasingly difficult, and the ammunition on the front lines in Bakhmut is decreasing. Yes, at the moment the Ukrainian armed forces are using giant tank brigades, assault units to hunt down the Russians in the key city of Bakhmut. But the cost is high, as stated, according to European Commission data available to LP. Russia fires between 40 to 50,000 artillery shells a day, equivalent to the amount spent by 5 to 6,000 Ukrainian forces. The Estonian government, one of the biggest contributors to Kiev's war effort, keeps the average artillery used between 20 and 60,000 Russian rounds and 2 to 7,000 Ukrainian rounds per day, according to a document sent by Tallinn to EU member states. These figures equate to between 60 and 210,000 million Russian rounds fired per month, compared to the amount that Ukrainian artillery fired between 600,000 and 1.8. In other words, Russia has a numerical advantage of 10 heavy weapons against each of Kiev's subordinates. But the Ukrainians managed to retain the advantage on the battlefield, even in this 10-to-1 situation. However, in the future, problems such as the lack of military ammunition will affect both sides of the war. More Ukrainian military intelligence chief Kyrylo Budanov, in an interview with the Voice of America, stated that the next 3 months will be very active on the front and will determine the course of the clashes, while also calling for more military assistance. US military intelligence reports say Moscow has its own ammunition supply problems, and strategists say the Russian military is trying to protect what it has. Because of this, the number of artillery shells fired in the last 2 months has dropped, according to several reports. The Kremlin has also shifted its priorities to specific targets such as Bakhmut and other points on the Donbass front line, which stand on the strategically important Kremen-Svatov axis. Moscow has an advantage through its vast military manufacturing industry and is believed to receive more supplies from Iran and North Korea. There are concerns in Washington that China may soon enter the equation. The EU and NATO allies are looking for ways to supply Ukraine with more ammunition. Time is very important. Kiev needs shipments in 2 to 3 weeks. EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Josep Borrell urged member states to show greater commitment and speed up the delivery of supplies from their arsenals. In a letter to the EU27 a few days ago, Borrell warned that Kiev urgently needs artillery and that member states are working on a new, improved and more attractive financing plan to replenish their offerings to Ukraine. Senior EU sources noted that while some countries have delivered substantial supplies, including ammunition to Ukraine, others have proven reluctant to further deplete their own stockpiles. Calling on Ukraine's allies to deliver more weapons and ammunition faster, NATO stressed that defense ministries would have to accept smaller stockpiles and that the alliance could logically ignore its own requirements for member state stockpiles for the time being. Therefore, the EDA and the weapons industry are examining what mechanisms and incentives can be implemented to expand it. In addition, the US, EU, and NATO aim to increase cooperation between weapons manufacturers to increase speed and efficiency in order for both Bakhmut and Ukraine's other front lines to be completely freed from the Russian threat. The EU, NATO, and other Ukraine's allies need to implement their military support plans as soon as possible.